Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Crossfire. Chapter 9. Unmoving, lying on its side, the mechanical rat looked like battle debris. It had seen better days, as its fur was singed, its casing was cracked, and part of its tail antenna was missing. Geordi nodded to Will, and he prodded the gizmo with his length of pipe. Even when shoved around, the rat continued to look dead. Of course, thought Geordi, that could be a defensive reaction. Outside, the battle reached its own welcome lull, and the pounding sounded dull and far away. Only the sirens continued to scream. Geordi gazed out the small window, noting that the sky was getting dark. Whether that was due to a storm, the smoke, or the coming of night was hard to tell. The light was fading, and here they were trapped in a basement in the middle of a war zone. But they weren't alone. They had two curious toys to keep them company, the robot and the phase modulator. Geordi glanced at the cryptic readouts on the modulator, and he made a mental note of the frequency that shut down the robot. And then he screwed up his courage, reached down, and grabbed the furry critter. It was hot to the touch, but not so hot that he couldn't hold it. The robot smelled of burned-out rotors, gears, and gyro servos. "I'd say this thing has seen hard duty," said Geordi, "and you kicking it across the room into a puddle didn't do it much good." "Too bad," said Will with satisfaction. Geordi turned the robot over, plucked out some fake hairs, and studied the bottom panel. There were strange patterns etched in the metal. He couldn't read the patterns, but there were serial numbers that he recognized. "This is a Federation patent number," he said. "A Federation world made this reconnaissance robot." "Who?" Geordi peered closely at the strange etchings. "I'm not a linguist. I can't tell more without opening it up. Maybe some of the chips are marked by point of origin. If we had the time and equipment, we could analyze the programming and find a signature that way." "Let's make sure we take it with us," said Will. "It might be useful to show Starfleet, if we ever get home alive." Suddenly, the thing sprang to life in Geordi's hands. Its little wheels skidded off his palms, causing sharp burns, and he yelped and dropped it. The robot hit the floor on its back and took a second to roll over, but that was a second too long, as Will brought the pipe down on the robot with a resounding crunch. The rat shot sparks for a few seconds, then it lay still. This time it really looked dead. Geordi shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry you had to do that." "I'm not," said Will. "I don't trust that thing." Geordi picked up the mechanical rat. This time its innards were rattling around, which was not a good sign. It probably had squeaked its last. He tucked the robot inside his dirty dress uniform and picked up his Corridan phase modulator. "We can't stay down here forever," said Geordi. "No," agreed Will. He tapped his comm badge. "Riker to gallant. Riker to gallant." "Give it up," said Geordi. "I've been trying that every 15 minutes. It doesn't work." Will shrugged and tapped it again. "Riker to Captain Webb." "Riker to Webb." "Riker, Webb here," came a voice that crackled with static. "The Gallant had to leave orbit, but most of us are okay and accounted for. Find shelter and await further orders." "Yes, sir," answered Will. "LaForge is with me." "Good. Are either of you seriously injured?" "No, sir." "Keep a low profile and wait my orders. Webb out." With a worried frown, Will picked up his trombone. "I guess it's dangerous in orbit, too." Geordi sat down on the dirty floor. "Is this shelter? Should we just stay here or go somewhere else?" Will started to speak, but he was drowned out by a sizzling sound, like bacon frying. He and Geordi whirled around to see a neon green beam come slicing through the little window, cutting the floor in half. The beam plowed up debris like an invisible bulldozer. The cadets were caught in the half of the room nearest the staircase, and they stumbled out the door and clambered up the rubble. They had to claw their way through debris, and it was hard to keep their instruments from getting crushed. Geordi looked up to see a sleek aircraft floating above their heads. It was about the size of a canoe. It raked the building with its deadly beam, and debris started to rain down. He and Will staggered up the stairs and ran for their lives into the open street. The aircraft seemed to take notice of them for the first time, and it banked around and swept after them. How did it know they were in the basement? Wondered Geordi. There was no time to ponder this question with death swooping down. He and Will jumped into a crater just as the aircraft fired a volley directly at them. The shot was high, but it blasted a storefront and showered the street with bits of molten glass. The craft dipped lower to get a better angle, and Geordi could feel its sights homing in. From nowhere, a phaser blast sheared the aircraft's bow, and a chunk of it went flying off. The craft spun out of control and nearly crashed. Somehow it righted itself at the last moment and chopped off a delicate turret as it zoomed away. The pilot was good, thought Geordi, and he would live to fight another day, but why was he trying to kill them? Still panting for breath, Geordi turned and waved gratefully at the Orions, but they were already falling back and didn't seem to know that he and Will were there. To them, it was just a lucky shot taken in the middle of a retreat, but it had saved the cadets' lives. The sky was turned into rose-colored twilight, made more spectacular by the acrid smoke. Soon it would be night, which didn't bother Geordi much, as he could see well in the dark, but the rest of the cadets would be at a disadvantage in the darkness. It made him long for those double suns of Pacifica. The thrilling music, the competition, the beach, and the roller coaster, all of that seemed so long ago, and it was only yesterday. He looked up and decided that the gloom in the clouds could only be the onset of night. With a groan, Will rolled over and looked at him. What now? Find shelter and await orders. Will sat up and looked around the shallow crater. Where can you get shelter on this crazy planet? If you're indoors, the buildings fall on you. If you're outdoors, the fighters strafe you. Then let's go someplace in between, said Geordi. Let's find a building that has mostly fallen down, but still has some walls for cover. Let's get there soon, said Will, glancing upward. It's getting dark. The cadets dragged themselves to their feet and crouched down, expecting the sky to erupt with fighters. When calm prevailed, Geordi looked for the lowest skyline and headed in that direction. He and Will jogged as fast as they could while jumping over the craters and debris. It was odd to be running through a desolate city at twilight looking for a bombed-out building. There was no shortage of decrepit structures to choose from, but most of them looked too dangerous. Geordi finally found exactly what he was looking for, a building which had been sheared in half between the first and second floors. Most of the first-story walls stood intact, but the roof and ceiling were gone. It would give them some cover, but they wouldn't be crushed by falling debris. He motioned to Will, who followed him through a breach in the wall. Geordi knew he should have been more cautious, but he was getting nervous running in the middle of the street. He felt too vulnerable, too much in the open. Geordi kicked away some rubble to make himself a place to sit. Then he slumped against the wall. He found that he was in a very long shadow, and he noted that the sun was setting behind him. He looked up at the sky and saw the dark clouds swirling angrily. Will stumbled in after him. After he found a place to set his trumpet, he collapsed. It's not Pacifica, he wheezed, but it will do. Geordi took stock of their so-called shelter. They were vulnerable on the starboard side of the building, where the wall was crumbling. Still, it was comforting to look up and see the sky and look around and see walls. Looking at the sky gave him hope that the gallant would return and they would be rescued. Until then, it was back to survival instincts. His instincts told him to stay put for now and hope for the best. Will gazed at the sky and smiled wistfully. I always thought I wanted to join Starfleet because I love adventure. But I'd rather be taking that propulsion exam right now. Geordi chuckled. That is Stevenson's corollary. When you're in your armchair, you'd rather be having an adventure. When you're having an adventure, you'd rather be in your armchair. With that thought in mind, Geordi yawned and dozed off for a moment. Actually, it was hard for him to know if he was awake or asleep because both states were unreal. He had a dream for a moment of Elephim when it had been vibrant and full of people living, not dying. However, the people of Elephim had an arrogant streak. They had challenged their neighbors over minor affairs, and their neighbors had ganged up on them. Now the original inhabitants were defeated and long gone, and the victors fought among themselves for the spoils. Without much risk, they hired faceless mercenaries to keep the conflict going. Geordi bolted upright from his dream, wondering how he knew so much in such clear detail. On impulse, he reached into his tunic and took out the robotic rat. Had the thing somehow affected his mind? Then he looked at the Corridan phase modulator. He knew barely 10% of what the alien device was capable of doing. What if it really did affect brainwaves on a subliminal level? It had already communicated with the robot, that was clear. What if it was still communicating with the robot? Stranger yet, what if the modulator was then communicating with Geordi? He shook his head. What if he was just dreaming? That was a more likely explanation. Geordi glanced at Will and saw his friend was in a similar stupor, trying to keep his eyes open. He was about to drift back to sleep when he heard the tromp of footsteps. It sounded like a parade, minus the drummers and instruments. Geordi sat up now, and so did Will. They looked around at the crumbling walls which surrounded them, and suddenly they didn't feel so safe. Geordi chanced to look out of the hole they had crawled through to reach this refuge. Marching down the center of the street was a column of Orion soldiers. They picked their way through the rubble, but they didn't mind being seen. They were definitely on a mission. In fact, they looked as if they were headed straight for Geordi and Will's hideout. That had to be a coincidence, thought Geordi, like the wild shot that had saved their lives, but where were the Orions going so boldly? He ducked back into the building and slumped against the wall. Will had been standing on some rubble, peering over the top of the wall, and he dropped down into a crouch. "I don't think they've seen us," whispered Will. "What do you think they'll do?" Geordi shrugged. "They seem to be going somewhere. They'll probably march right past us." "Yeah," said Will with relief. "Besides, they're on our side, right? We entertained them." "That was a great concert," Geordi sighed. "We took them out of this war for a while." He was startled when he heard orders being barked in the street. The stomping footsteps stopped abruptly, and there was the clack of machinery. Geordi didn't want to poke his head out again, but he had no choice. It sounded as if the Orion soldiers were making camp in the street, directly in front of their hiding place. That might not be a bad thing unless they attracted hordes of deadly aircraft. Again, Geordi inched out of his hole to try to find out what was going on. To his horror, he saw Orion setting a half-dozen weapons on tripods. They were aimed directly at the cadet's hiding place. Geordi scurried backwards, slumped against the wall, and gasped, "They're about to open fire on us! We've got to get out of here!" Will bounced to his feet, but it was too late as the first phaser blast cut a diagonal path through the wall. The cadets dropped to their stomachs as the beam slashed through the building. It leveled the wall behind them. "Hold your fire!" shouted Geordi, but his words were drowned out by more phaser fire, followed by a photon grenade and a thunderous explosion. Geordi curled into a ball as the Orion forces opened fire upon their crumbling shelter. Chapter 10. "Why us?" cried Will as the Orions blasted away. He grabbed his trombone and hugged it to his chest. The question hit Geordi like a slap in the face. Why us? What had brought them here? And what had brought the deadly aircraft after them? There was only one answer. Geordi reached into his tunic and pulled out the furry robot. With no time to think, he jumped to his feet and tossed the gizmo as far as he could. Then he hit the dirt as the assault on their position continued. Suddenly, the wilting fire stopped, and there came a flurry of new orders. Geordi heard the machinery and the footsteps moving briefly, and then the dreadful beams arced across the night sky. He covered his head, but this time the phasers and photon grenades were directed elsewhere. The building beside them took thunderous hits. It was demolished in a few seconds. That was where Geordi had thrown the robot. Will grabbed his sleeve and pointed toward the open spaces behind them. Where there had once been a wall was now a chalky outline. "Let's get out of here," he whispered. They picked up their instruments and padded out the back. Without saying a word, they ran at least 2 kilometers, just trying to put distance between themselves and the Orion troops. Geordi really did feel as if they were caught in the crossfire. They had been fired at by both sides. Will held up his hand and staggered to a stop. "What did you do back there?" Geordi gasped for breath. "I threw that stupid robot away. The Orions must have detected it, and they were homing in to destroy it." "Some souvenir," muttered Riker. "Sorry I suggested we take it along." Geordi shrugged. "It wasn't your fault. I would have taken it anyway." He shook his head in amazement. "Look at us, dragging our musical instruments through a war zone." Will hefted his trombone. "They probably think this is a Klingon disruptor." Geordi chuckled. Then he shifted back to uneasy attention. He looked around at their present surroundings, a hilly part of town that had winding roads and the ruins of several large houses. They weren't safe yet, but the hills offered some escape routes from the low-flying aircraft. "Geordi," said Will nervously, "we've got company again." He turned to see about a dozen Orion soldiers come running or limping down the hill. They were pursued by one of the aircraft, but it had to swerve upward to avoid plowing into the opposite hill. The Orions took that opportunity to duck into the ragged bushes along the sides of the road. Geordi looked at Will, and the two of them ran as fast as they could in the opposite direction. They soon found themselves climbing a hill out in the open, and Geordi became nervous again. He heard the whine of an engine in his head, but he didn't know if it was real or imaginary. "Get in the bushes!" he barked. Will glanced at him, then remembered other times that he'd been right. Both of them dropped to the pavement and rolled into the bushes. The aircraft soared across the hill, but it didn't open fire. It seemed to be moving on. The cadets lay still with brambles sticking them in the back for several minutes until they were sure the fighting had moved on. Breathing again, Geordi crawled out of their hiding place. He sat on the hillside and fired up the Corridan phase modulator. "Geordi," said Will, "what do you think you're doing? We can't take time out to play any music. Now we've got to escape." "To where?" asked Geordi. "There's no shelter unless we can create it. This is just a little experiment. It won't take long." He started playing the modulator and the frequencies which had controlled the robotic rat. He was pleased to find that he could shift around and overlap signals with ease. Geordi finally had an ear for the modulator, as musicians would say. Only it didn't involve the ear. He knew he was communicating with something out there, just as a musician knows he has reached an audience. "You're going to get us killed," warned Will. "You know, the Orions are homing in on these signals, and so are the aircraft." "You wanted to get them talking, didn't you?" asked Geordi. "Through a musical instrument?" Geordi shrugged. "Why not? Music hath charms to soothe the savage beast. Breast, whatever. This is music I can't hear, but I can feel it through my instrument. I don't use my senses in a typical way, so maybe I'm more attuned to this." Suddenly there was a strange squeaking sound, and Geordi saw movement in the shadows around him. The scraggly shrubbery by the side of the road began to twitch and jerk. Will raised his trombone like a weapon and stepped back. "Stop playing," ordered Will. Geordi held his hands up. "I stopped already." He looked down at the phase modulator, wondering exactly what he had been doing. It was as if his playing wasn't his own, but a collaboration between himself, the modulator, the audience, and his subconscious mind. He turned the machine off. Then he looked up to see a huge pack of rodents, snakes, and frogs come hopping and slithering out of the bushes. "Whoa, Geordi," said Will, backing up. "What did you do?" "I guess I'm the Pied Piper," answered Geordi. "I seem to be speaking their language." "Then tell them to go away," said Will nervously. He turned around to run in the opposite direction, but the robotic menagerie were closing in from both sides. "Why so many?" muttered Will. "The enemy must have just released them," said Geordi. "Maybe it's in preparation for a big strike. They're perfect for reconnaissance and picking targets. No wonder the Orions are low on morale. How can they fight these things?" "Can you put them all to sleep?" asked Will. Geordi looked worriedly at the army of crawling robots. They were not moving, just waiting in eerie silence. "Putting them to sleep would be taking sides in the conflict." "You said they were made by a Federation world, so that would mean that the Prime Directive doesn't apply. Both of these sides are already at our level of technology." "That's true." Geordi looked at the phase modulator in his hands. By accident, he had stumbled upon a way to communicate with one of the warring factions. Could he turn the tide in battle? How important were these tiny robots? "They're trying to kill us, aren't they?" asked Geordi. Will nodded. "They sure are, and if you won't put them to sleep, you've got to throw the phase modulator away, or it's going to get us killed." Geordi turned on the instrument. "What if this backfires?" "Geordi," said Will, "everybody is trying to kill us now. How can things get any worse?" The cadet nodded somberly and looked at his audience of fake robots, fake rodents and reptiles. A green and orange snake curled up by his feet, waiting patiently. He took a deep breath and plied the colorful buttons, taking up where he had left off. At once he felt the strange feedback he had noticed before, a feeling of comfort and satisfaction. Several of the rodents fell to their sides and looked as dead as the first one. Of course, remembered Geordi, the first one had come alive again. He continued to play until all the tiny robots became inactive. Geordi faded out by decreasing the power, and he finally ended the second concert on Elephant that day. He watched the robots nervously, waiting to see if they would reawaken, but they remained still and unmoving. "Good job," whispered Will. "At least we can get away from them. Let's go." Gripping their instruments, Geordi and Will tiptoed through the sleeping sea of rats and reptiles. Geordi glanced over his shoulder, wondering if their actions could have any effect on the war. A bunch of reconnaissance robots couldn't affect the war that much, could they? He tried to stop thinking about the Prime Directive. Their orders were to seek shelter. Since there was no safe zone, they would have to create their own shelter. That wasn't a misuse of technology, only a matter of survival. When they got about 30 meters beyond the circle of robots, Will stopped and considered the twisting streets. "Where to?" "We don't want to get lost," said Geordi. "We want the captain to be able to find us. Let's make our way back to the place we gave the concert." Will shrugged. "I don't like that idea, but I can't think of a better one." He pointed his trombone down the closest street and marched off. Geordi followed his friend, although he was feeling increasingly uneasy again. The sirens were a dull throb in the distance, and the heavy explosions were even farther off. Still, he hugged his phase modulator tightly to his chest. Night didn't usually bother him, but this one did. He wanted to crouch down and wait for daylight, but they were better off to keep moving. So far, every time they had stopped, they'd been attacked. He glanced again over his shoulder. That was when he saw it, a telltale vapor trail high above the clouds. The aircraft was coming their way, closing ground quickly. "Will!" shouted Geordi. "Aircraft right behind us, dropping in altitude!" Will whirled around. "How many?" "Just one." Geordi dashed off the street and crouched down in the thin shrubbery. "Maybe it'll fly over us," suggested Will. Geordi studied the sky, waiting for the deadly craft to break through the cloud vapor. With his visor, he could see the vapor trail plus a smaller plasma trail in front of it. That was odd, and he wondered if it could be some other kind of craft. Like an arrow, the fighter sliced through the clouds and shot straight toward them. Geordi gasped. Now he knew where the plasma stream was coming from. It shot from a hole in the craft's nose cone. This was the same ship that had tried to kill them before. "Run!" shouted Geordi. He jumped over the shrubs and ran until the ground suddenly disappeared beneath him. With a yell, Geordi tumbled down a hill covered with brambles and debris. He wrapped his arms protectively around the phase modulator and tried to stop himself with his legs. He finally bounced to a rough stop next to the crumbling wall of a house. As he tried to regain his senses, a beam shot across the night sky and obliterated the hill where he and Will had been standing. Clods of dirt rained down upon him, and Geordi scrambled to his feet. "Will!" he shouted. Will Riker! There was no answer. Frightened, Geordi lifted his head to see the aircraft making a wide bank in the night sky. It doubled back, slowed to hover speed, and strafed the hill with its lethal rays. Debris poured down upon Geordi, but he dragged himself to his feet. Keeping his head low, he tried to run. A ferocious explosion knocked him off his feet, and the entire hill erupted in flame. Geordi shook his head and tried to face his enemy, but the flames were like a furnace. The craft must have blasted open an underground fuel tank. He stumbled backward, hoping the fire would spoil the pilot's aim. But the deadly beam kept coming. It cut a path of flame down the hillside, straight toward Geordi.